So this is a painting I did about a year ago. Let's try and repaint it. What's up, Liron here. Thank you for joining me in another video. And today I want to try out something really fun. What we're going to do is try and repaint this little subject that I did about a year ago, I think, more or less. I could be wrong about the exact date, but I think it's been about a year, if not even a little more, a little over a year. So in any case, back then I had a particular approach to painting, and now I guess things changed. So I thought it would be an interesting experiment to try and do the same scene once again, maybe in a bit of a different format, but we're gonna see how it's gonna work, okay? This is, I think, something that I will talk about it in the conclusion, but I think it is beneficial to draw the same subject a few times so that you learn to master different aspects of it. Maybe focus every time on a different element or aspect. So this could be a way of demonstrating it. So in any case, without further ado, let's get started. So I'm starting with the drawing process, and I didn't want to overburden you with some of it, so I'm running through it really fast. And also, well, I didn't skip anything. This is really the beginning. So the first step for this is the drawing, really, as always. And this is where you need to put in a lot of thought into, do you keep the composition that you see, or do you change things around? So notice how I'm drawing the entire kind of vase thingy and the entire apple before erasing some of the non-necessary details. And I find it easier to draw shapes that obstruct each other if you fully draw them to some extent, and then you're able to more accurately draw them. So I decided to keep the composition of the picture because I think it's a really good one. So I just have the three apples to the left, and then this little jar thing to the right, drawing all of the details as much as I can. You know, I go through periods when I try to get in as much information as possible in the drawing stage, and sometimes I feel more like I want to take it easy and allow the paint to do more. I find that drawing less can really loosen you up when it's time to draw. But it really is a matter of personal preference, mood, and this is something that changes from time to time depending on what I'm working on and everything. So anyway, now we're almost near the end of the drawing process. I'm just adding a few minor details here and there, and this is enough to go by. Notice how I already inserted where the shadows are gonna be. This is the most important part. You want to make sure that you know where you're gonna shade. Now, the apples have a very strong red and yellow feeling to them. So this is what I'll try and cover in the first wash. I'll try to already put in the yellow and the reds, and just to make sure that everything is even and nice. I don't want to have too many breaks or to feel like that initial wash is maybe it's a bit fragmented or something like this. And this can be a challenge because when you paint just one apple, then it's easy. But when you add another and another one, it's a bit harder. I'm gonna also make use of the wet and wet, as you'll soon see, to get the texture of the red stripes across the apple going. But for this, I need to wait for the paint already on the paper to dry a little bit, okay? And I'm going to use really thick paint to do these red highlights. Otherwise, the paint is going to spread out too much. So you can see I'm using really thick paint for these little marks. And this establishes really the initial wash. I'm still not going in for the super deep shadows. You know, on the bottom right side of this apple, there's a very, very deep shadow. I'm still not putting that in. So in any case, I am trying to get a lot of details in. So when you do this, you really need to be careful for the wash not to dry too much on you. And then, you know, again, you lose the evenness of it. So going back to what I said earlier, when you paint several shapes that are together, many times you'll need to connect them really well together, and to just paint them as one big shape with many different shadows and elements in it. Okay, so treating it as one big shape can really help, and even visualizing it as one shape. So now I'm gonna have some trouble because the apple on the bottom right, when I'll come in and paint it, I need to make sure I don't touch the apple at the top too much, because it's already drier. So with this stage, I'll have to be a little careful. And these are the things you want to be aware of. It's okay if some of the layer dried. You just need to be aware of how you're interacting with it again. So I'm trying to not reawaken it too much. Now, my advantage here is that
this part of the top apple is going to be shaded. So when you're going to shade it anyway, it's okay if there's some blossoms, as you can see, that are now created between the top and bottom apples. So that's fine. And now I'm starting to go really dark and deep here with the oranges and the reds, and what's important is to leave a highlight on that little I forgot. Geez, I know I'd forget the name of this word, but in any case, you're gonna leave a comment below and let me know what you call this little thing that I knew, like the stem, maybe, I guess. So you see I'm keeping the stem area a little lighter, but later on I'm still not keeping it white, because if you look at the reference, it's not white, okay? It's not a complete highlight, and you want to make sure that you don't exaggerate things. Many times a painting can look a little illustrative and not realistic, which is fine if that's what you're aiming for, but a lot of people aim for realism and they mess up the realism because they exaggerate things too much. The shadows become too dark, the highlights become too light. And this entire scene is really dark. There's literally nothing here that stays white. Everything is going to be darkened. So now I'm going about it the other way around, and I'm connecting the apple to that vase, and I'm going from the side because that's where the shadow is. And generally watercolor, we work from light to dark, but in this case I decided to switch things around a little. Now it's still wet, so I will try and make more use of wet and wet and add a bit of a texture to it, as you can see here, just splashing some paint over it. A few important notes about the tools I'm using. So I'm using a silver black velvet brush. This is a size, I believe, 8. I have another one size 12. These are my favorites. The paper is Saunders Waterford, cold press, so it has a texture to it. This one is 600 grams. And the paints I'm using are PWC by Shinhan. I'm using cobalt blue, cadmium yellow deep, and cadmium red deep. Okay, these are the colors I'm using. Now I'm skipping some of the process to save some time, but generally this is what I'm doing. Now with this apple, I don't want to create too many details, too many distractions, because it's pretty much at the side, compositionally speaking. So I'm going to do some wet and wet, but really soft, and I'm not necessarily going to darken it as much as the other apples. Moving on. I do indicate some kind of a shadow there, but I'm not going to darken it as much as the other ones are going to be in upcoming layers. So now I'm adding the stem for that top apple, and we're done with the first wash for the actual subject. Now we're working on the negative space. We're negative painting the background. It should be really dark, and my only qualm with these paints is that the blue can't be dark enough. The cobalt blue here stays relatively light, and this is something I also talked about in the video and also in the blog post I did for the review of the Shinhan trio that I am working with now. So that's my only qualm with these, and you can't really get a super dark blue with them. Okay, so that's something to take into consideration. Maybe choose a better blue than I did, maybe some kind of phthalo blue or, something like this. In any case, now I'm negative painting carefully around the apples. Many people at this stage will turn the page upside down because it's easier sometimes to start with the more intricate area and then move on to the flatter area, but I decided to do it, just to leave it like that and just be really careful and quick. You can always use a spray bottle to spray some things around, keep the wash fresh, and to make sure it doesn't dry while you're working on a very complex, maybe negative painting or something like this. So now I'm starting to add the darker shadows of the vase, and this will really bring out its shape, and you will soon see how that metal ring here is going to come to life. So I'm trying to vary the shadows. I'm trying to keep it interesting. I will connect the shadow here on the vase with the shadow on the ring, as you see now, making sure to connect as many of the shadows as possible. And actually covering the entire ring because it is in its entirety darker. So hopefully I'll do that in just a moment. And now I'm still working on that right side area of the vase, making sure that it is dry enough. It is, dark enough. Adding the shadow under the ring. I think maybe my plan was to shade the deepest parts of the ring and then come back with the kind of mid-tone to them. But this ring, I covered the entirety of it. Okay, so you see, because it is all darker than the vase. Now, a common mistake that I see a lot of people make, and I make as well, is to paint the values relatively. So you paint an area relative to another area relative to another area, and you lose the entire value structure, I guess, of the scene or the reference or the painting, because what happens is if you make a small mistake here in the relativity, then you make another one there, then the mistakes compound. So what I recommend doing is to just compare, if you are going for a realistic look, to compare the values on an area to area basis. How dark is the top of the lip of the vase? How dark the bottom is? How dark the ring is? And you just compare it to your reference instead of going relatively. Many times when I talked to you just a few moments ago about exaggerating the highlights and the shadows, many times these exaggerations happen because you do it, on a relative scale of values, and then you see something is light, you go a little darker with another thing, but you didn't do it accurately enough. Okay, so that happens many times. It happens to me all the time. It's something I'm still struggling with. It's just like a non-stop learning curve. So now I have that bottom area of the shadow of the vase, and my plan is to connect it with the shadows on the apples, just like I did before, only the other way around. This time I started right to left. I don't remember exactly why I decided to start with the top of the vase, of the lip of the vase, but there was a good reason for that. Now I blended some of the edges, and you'll notice how some edges I blend, some edges I keep clean and sharp, just to have some interest and to create some kind of a, I guess, variety of edges. This always helps. The variety of edges always helps to make it look better. So now I'm shading with a green color, and the shadow here, it has a tint of green. This entire apple at the bottom right has a bit of a green undertone to it. I don't know if I'm being completely accurate. Again, colors and matching colors and matching values is something that I think I will struggle with for a while now. And it's amazing how much of an influence an accurate value representation has, because we see the world mostly in values, not even in colors. So as long as you get the values to be accurate, you're good to go. And the painting will look accurate and beautiful. It's funny because these are the words that I find myself saying the most in my videos, but it is true, A lot of people like to sometimes complicate things, but I think the basics of watercolor, aside from the techniques that it just takes some time to master and to learn how fast to work or how slow to work, the basics are pretty straightforward. It's just about, just like any type of other painting media, getting the values to be accurate. So now I'm expanding the shadow. I think I could have maybe expanded the shadow using a pure blue and not just gray. I think the gray can take away some of the interest, but in any case, now I'm painting the tabletop. Now the thing is, you have to be really careful, because now I'm working in close proximity to existing washes, and you want to make sure not to awaken them as you paint over them. So what I'm doing is working really quickly and making sure I don't dwell on one place too much, and I don't muck around with it and take my time too much, because then it will reawaken the layer underneath it. This is especially true for cheaper papers and also for hot pressed papers that are smoother and the paint tends to sit more on the surface of the paper. Cold pressed paper is really forgiving in that sense, and it's also one of the reasons I love it. So for the inner shadow of the vase, I decided to use a pure blue. I decided to, because just from the fact that there wasn't enough blue back there, and there isn't enough blue in the entire painting as of now, just because it's hard to get the darkest values using it, so I had to mix in a lot of red just to get it to be darker again. So you want to make sure that all of your primary colors, if you can, have them be of a wide range of values. That's the best. I think that's the best possible scenario. I think the yellow can stay quite light, and that'll be fine, because yellows don't tend to get too dark. But you want both your reds and your blues to be strong, if possible. As you can see, you can make the best out of these kinds of situations as well, and it's definitely not a barrier. Now, one more thing you could do is to make the entire painting lighter, and then everything still works in relations to one another. So if you have the initial wash even lighter than I did it, and then the next wash even a little darker and a little darker, then you will get the better maybe incorporation of the blue here in this example. You can just make everything lighter, and I see a lot of artists in watercolor that work a little more transparent, a little lighter, and I think this is an experiment that it's worth for me to do as well, because I tend to go really dark and give a strong punch immediately, and sometimes it's not the best option. So I think this is something I should be doing a little more often, trying to keep things light, and then having the darkest darks be not as dark. They don't have to be pitch black. So in any case, now I'm adding a bit more blues, again, because the previous part didn't have enough blues, and I'm really working my way around the painting. Notice how, now a bit green, notice how when you work in different areas, you can afford a little more freedom, and the more layers you add, the more, I guess, you can, your area of work becomes smaller and smaller, because in the beginning you have to cover everything, then you just add little details, and so it becomes a little easier in that sense the more you go on. So now I added some dry brush textures to the apples. These will work nicely with the previous details that I did wet in wet. I think the contrast between the wet in wet and the dry brush is going to create some interesting effects there, of an underpainting and a drier brush. You can see that they work really well together, and I will show you the final result in just a moment, and hopefully you'll see this, because even if you look at the reference, you'll notice that some of the apples are a little more, I guess, a little blurrier. The details on them are a little blurrier, and then you have some sharper details. So I wanted to get that impression in there as well. And now I'm using my tiny rigger brush just to get some of the details on the stems. These are really important, again, to give it a small pop, but not too much. You don't want to overdo that step as well. And in any case, this is it. I will now show you the final result, and we can wrap up the video. Okay, so soon the big moment, and I will compare this to my older painting, but first off, I just want to kind of conclude the process. So there were many times when I felt like the paint is really doing what I wanted it to do, and I was in pretty good control. And then there were times where it was a bit more of a challenge, and I think around the second wash, I started having some trouble, but very minor. I think I did a very good job with the wets in wets. If I kind of take a few steps back, I really love this area of the kind of vase or whatever that is. This apple, I think, turned out really well. And also this one with the dry brush, I really, really love it. It's a shame that this one is a bit messy, though I don't know exactly how I would go about correcting it, but I'm still really pleased with the overall result. So now let's compare it to the previous one, and here we go. So here are the two paintings together, and I don't really know what to say. I kind of like both. With this one, remember, I didn't paint the vase or anything. I just painted the apples, but I have to say I like both. I think, well, this one definitely has more realistic colors. They are not completely realistic, kind of impressionistic, and from what I see, this one is more in the fantasy land. I will say I love the transition into shadow, into the deep shadow in both of these. So I can't really decide which one I like more. I think they both just represent a part of my creation and my creativity. I'd love to know what you think in a comment below. I still won't take off the tape because I want it to dry a bit, because if you don't want the paper to stay buckled, you kind of need to allow it some time to dry. So anyway, this is it. Thank you so much for watching, and let's wrap up this vid. So this is it. I really hope you enjoyed this video. It's been a really fun one and a nice challenge to paint the same scene, because I didn't really know what the result is going to be like. I have to say I'm really pleased with this. I think, to me at least, it's obvious that I have a better understanding of composition and how to arrange things around, and also I think better understanding of colors and how to use them. So yeah, it was just a very interesting and fun little exercise to do, and I really recommend you try it out. Maybe revisit an old scene or reference you used in the past, because it will also allow you to see what kind of changes you've gone through in your style and in your approach. Okay, so anyway, this is it. I really hope you enjoyed this vid. I have tons of other videos, so if you're still not subscribed, if you're just a lurker, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button as well, because that way you will receive updates on new videos. I post like 3 a week.
In addition to that, there will be links in the description box to my podcast and to my Patreon page and to my Instagram page and to many, many, many different places that you may want to check out. So feel free to. And this is it. I will talk to you again real soon.